Dr. Gary Zammit, the President and CEO of Clinolabs Drug Development Corporation. And with me today is Dr. Eric Siemers, the Chief Medical Officer at Acumen Pharma. Dr. Siemers and I are going to have a conversation about Acumen and the work that they're doing there. So before we begin talking about Acumen, Dr. Siemers, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, sure. Thanks, Gary. My background is I'm a neurologist by training. Actually started off my career on the faculty at Indiana University School of Medicine. And there I actually founded and ran what's called a movement disorder clinic. So we saw a lot of patients with things like Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease and did a lot of clinical trials with those patients. So I do have some hands-on experience doing clinical trials. After about 12 years, I got more interested in drug development, things you really can't do at a university, and went to work at Eli Lilly and Company and got involved in their Alzheimer's program. So started off in the early phase group, and then actually went to the late phase group with a couple of different drugs that we were testing at the time, and was there actually a total of 19 years until Lilly offered all of their U.S. employees an early retirement package, and I qualified and I took the package and went to work at Acumen as one of the first things I did after taking the retirement package. The other kind of interesting part to that story is that several of my colleagues at Lilly also qualified for the retirement package. They took the package, and most of us are now involved one way or another with Acumen. So to some extent, we got the band back together.
That's great. So you're bringing a lot of shared experiences into Acumen.
Yeah, we do have a lot of experience. In fact, we've estimated that the group of us who came from Lilly to Acumen, and now we all are involved in the clinical trials, we probably collectively have over 100 person years of drug development experience in Alzheimer's disease.
Wow. And what in particular attracted you to Acumen? There are so many biotechs that are involved in Alzheimer's disease drug development. What attracted you to Acumen in particular?
Well, in terms of the attraction to Acumen, a lot of that was really driven by the drug that Acumen is testing now. This drug it's a monoclonal antibody, so that's a type of drug that's used for a lot of different diseases right now. I had the good fortune of having the CEO of Acumen contact me shortly after I left Lilly. And he told me about this drug, which I wasn't really aware of at the time because it wasn't in the clinic yet, that targeted something called A beta oligomers, which was really unique. So in Alzheimer's disease, you have what are called amyloid plaques, and those plaques are made up of a sticky protein called A beta. And a lot of drug development in Alzheimer's disease has centered around targeting A beta or targeting the plaques. And in fact, there's one drug, a monoclonal antibody, that actually recently got an accelerated approval from FDA that targeted these amyloid plaques. But over the last probably 20 years, there's been evolving evidence that the toxic species is not really the single A beta of what we call monomers, and it's not really the plaques. It's something in between, something that we call A beta oligomers. So this is a few of the A betas stuck together. They come in various different sizes, but there's a lot of evidence now that's the toxic species. When I had this first conversation with the Acumen CEO, and he told me about this antibody that was targeting this toxic species, my reaction to that was, well, this just needs to get into the clinic, because there wasn't any drug like that in the clinic. And as it turns out, of course, we are in the clinic now, and we're the only monoclonal antibody that was specifically developed to target these A beta oligomers. And so that makes us actually very excited about doing the trial and getting the results and seeing what happens when you target these A beta oligomers.
And what kind of therapeutic benefit would you hope to find? I know we can't make predictions about outcomes, but what would you be looking for? Is this the type of medicine that would slow down cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease, or is it potentially the type of medicine that would stop the progression or reverse cognitive decline? What are the therapeutic effects that you might be interested in with a medication like this?
The types of therapeutic effects that we see in Alzheimer's disease are classified into two general types. One would be what we call symptomatic therapies. Now, there are symptomatic therapies that are available today. Most of those were approved in the 1990s or early 2000s. And they provide a little bit of an improvement in your Alzheimer's symptoms and in memory in particular, which is, of course, one of the main symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So they do provide a modest benefit, but they don't change the underlying pathology of the disease. And so you don't really change the decline that you get. So what you'll see with these symptomatic drugs typically is you're a little if when you start the drugs, you're a little better for maybe 6 months or so. But after that, because the disease is progressing, the disease just continues to progress. So it buys you a little time, but it doesn't really affect the underlying disease process. Now, the other category of therapeutic effects are what are sometimes called disease modifying drugs. Now, the drug that we're developing at Acumen, we would put into that class as a disease modifying drug. And what those do is slow the rate of decline. And this is an important point for patients because, as I think most people know, one of the problems with Alzheimer's disease is that you gradually lose certain abilities. In other words, after a while, you can't drive. After a while, you might not recognize your grandchildren. After a while, you may not be able to travel. So by slowing down the progression of the disease, you add some time before you lose those abilities. Now, right now, we can't really expect the drug to completely stop the progression. That would be great. We don't really expect that to happen for, perhaps some time. But we do expect to have some of these drugs, and it's actually an important and exciting time in the field right now because some of these monoclonal antibodies are apparently having some effect on disease progression. Not all the phase 3 trials are finished, but there's some promising data there for the field in general. And so for ACU 193, the drug that Acumen is developing, we will be carefully looking at whether or not the drug slows the rate of disease progression. There's a small chance that there would be some improvement in symptoms, kind of like the old symptomatic drugs, but that's probably not particularly likely. So what we'll really focus on is to determine whether ACU 193 can actually slow the rate of progression of the disease. And we can only determine that through clinical trials.
Is that really the standard or most important outcome, do you think, in Alzheimer's disease trials in general, slowing the progression?
It depends on whether or not you are talking about what we would call a symptomatic drug versus a disease modifying drug. So again, the symptomatic drugs, they give you an acute modest improvement, but it's an improvement, but it doesn't change the slope at all, the rate of decline. But what people are more focused on now are these disease modifying drugs. And in that case, yes, it's all about how much can you slow the rate of decline. The one other thing I might mention is that most people in the field at this point don't think there's going to be one drug that's going to completely take care of Alzheimer's disease. It's likely that drugs will be used in combination, similar to what's done in cancer frequently. And by using combinations of drugs, that will actually have the best effect in terms of slowing down the rate of progression of the disease.
Now, Acumen has started the INTERCEPT trial, has been engaged in this clinical trial project. Can you describe that trial and a bit about its methodology, the objectives of the trial, and what's happening today?
Intent of the INTERCEPT-AD trial is to do what's called a phase one study. So phase one studies are very early in the development of a drug. It's actually the first time that a drug is given to a human. And because of that, the main thing that we look for in a phase one study is always safety. And so safety comes first. People only get one administration of this, which, by the way, is an intravenous infusion. So they get one of these intravenous infusions. And we just watch them very, very carefully for any kind of safety effects. Now, the study also includes some other people who will receive 3 different administrations of ACU 193, and those would be either 4 weeks apart or 2 weeks apart. But again, the first thing that you look for is safety, and that's always the primary outcome, or what we would call the primary outcome for one of these studies. But even though that's the primary outcome that we look at, we will look at many other things in these studies. And so one of the things we'll measure is the concentration of the drug of ACU 193 in blood and also in spinal fluid, which is the fluid that everyone has that surrounds the brain and spinal cord. We'll look at something called target engagement, which is a really important concept for us, which means we'll determine whether or not the ACU 193 got into the brain and then bound to these oligomers that it's designed to bind to. Now, that's been shown before in animal studies, but the proof is in the pudding when you get into the clinic. And so we'll also be measuring that in the clinic. We will get sort of typical measures of cognitive functioning that are used in Alzheimer's studies, but in a phase one trial, we really don't expect to see a signal on those because the trial is just too small, and people are only given either 1 dose of the drug or 3 doses of the drug. But we have built a couple of extra things into the trial that we think they're exploratory. There's certainly no guarantee that we'll see something, but we built in some computerized testing of cognition, which should have more sensitivity in a small study like this. So we might be able to pick up an effect of the drug if it causes an actual improvement in cognition. And then we have something else built into the study that measures blood flow. So there's a long history of research showing that blood flow to the brain is decreased in Alzheimer's disease. So if we would see an improvement in blood flow in this little phase one study, we think that would be really important. So again, the primary thing that we look for is safety, but we also measure other things to get a better sense of how the drug might work in a larger phase 2 or phase 3 study.
Yeah, so you'll be collecting the safety data, but also all of these other very interesting outcomes that might influence future development plans. What type of people are you looking for to enter the study? What type of subject do you want to enroll in this particular project?
Yes, that's a very good question because the type of patient is something that researchers have looked at over time and has actually changed a little bit. So even 10 years ago, most of the trials of Alzheimer's disease for these disease-modifying drugs were in patients who had either mild dementia or moderate dementia. But there's 2 things that were found out. First of all, there's a lot of data now that would suggest that certainly by the time you get to moderate dementia, that there's so much damage to the brain that you really can't change the process anymore. So people have focused on mild dementia. And there's even a milder form of that where you don't meet criteria for dementia, but it's called mild cognitive impairment. And so that would be people with forgetfulness that's more than you would expect. And so the population that we look at are people with this mild cognitive impairment, so not even really meeting criteria for dementia yet, and people with mild dementia, but not moderate dementia, not severe dementia. Now, the other important thing that has been learned over the last several years is that a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease actually isn't all that good. So we now have a tool called a PET scan that will tell us whether or not you have these amyloid plaques in your brain, which really defines the disease. And what some studies showed a few years ago was that if you take even excellent clinicians and identify people with mild dementia that they say is due to Alzheimer's disease, about 25% of the time, those people won't have plaques. And if you don't have the plaques, you don't have Alzheimer's disease. You have some other cause of your dementia, and there are other causes of dementia, but you don't have Alzheimer's disease. If you look earlier at an MCI stage, it's even more marked. So if you take somebody with MCI, and even in the best of hands, if you think this is MCI due to Alzheimer's disease, about half of the time, actually, people don't have the amyloid plaques. So they have some other cause for their MCI. But that has really, I think, helped the field move forward because we're at earlier stages of the disease, but we also are only studying people that now we know that they have Alzheimer's pathology based on these PET scans. And I think that's been a really important advance in the field in terms of how clinical trials are done. So in our trial, we apply all those learnings. So we're in MCI plus mild dementia, and you have to have a positive PET scan showing these amyloid plaques.
So the people entering the study really have to be confirmed to have Alzheimer's disease in order to enter.
That's right. Prior to the availability of these PET scans, the only way to confirm the diagnosis was an autopsy. And so these PET scans have really been a major advance in the field because now we can identify the true pathology before an autopsy.
It's so interesting. And so of these people with mild cognitive impairment, about half of them will not test positive on PET. There's something else going on with them?
Yeah, that's correct. And for some people in that early MCI stage, mild cognitive impairment stage, if you follow them, sometimes they will revert back to normal cognition. And so it really is a little bit of a gray zone. Now, if you have the clinical characteristics of MCI and you do have a positive PET scan for amyloid, then we know that the course will be one of worsening. But for people who don't have amyloid plaques, it may be due to some other cause. Typically, those people don't progress as quickly, but occasionally people will revert back to cognitively normal. And I don't think anyone actually knows exactly how that happens.
So the people coming into the study for screening, I presume that they don't know if they have amyloid plaque. They don't know if they're positive on PET imaging. So getting this kind of information is new information for them, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And one of the things that you find is that occasionally, and this doesn't actually happen very often, people will have had a PET scan for some other reason, maybe another clinical trial, and so they will know their status. But typically, as you say, a person coming into this trial won't know their status, which we think is actually one of the major reasons to want to participate in a trial like this. Because if you are having memory problems, and maybe it's Alzheimer's, maybe it's not, you really don't know, as part of the trial, you'll get one of these PET scans and you'll get the answer.
So participants have access to the test results, essentially.
Yes, they will know if they were positive or not. Now, because if people have a negative PET scan, then we don't actually include them in the trial because there's no reason to use an Alzheimer's drug for somebody who doesn't have Alzheimer's disease. So yeah, the people know whether the scan is positive or not.
For those people who might be interested in participating, what would they have to do? They obviously have to go through some type of screening assessment, but what kind of commitments do they have to make in terms of visiting the doctor, a time commitment, a duration of participation, things like that?
So it is a commitment of time, and by the way, not only for the patient, but also for their study partner, which typically would be a spouse, could be another close family member, but somebody who knows them well. Because a lot of the information in these Alzheimer's trials comes not only from the patient, but also from what we call the study partner. So it's a commitment from two different people, actually. Um, but for the study itself, for the people who only get a single dose of the drug, and that's kind of the earlier stages of the study, they actually will be in an inpatient unit anywhere from 2 to 4 nights because we really want to watch them carefully because we're obviously monitoring their safety very carefully. Now, after those 2 to 4 days in an inpatient unit, then the study goes on for another 8 months or so as an outpatient. And that's after, again, just having this one single dose. That's how carefully we watch the safety. Now, for people who are in the later part of the study where you get more than one dose, at that point, we kind of feel like we have enough information that we don't have to have people in the hospital. So that part of the study is all done as an outpatient. And so they would come in for after the screening process, they come in, get their first dose, go home, either 4 weeks later or 2 weeks later, come back, get the second dose, and then come back and get the third dose. And then even after the third dose, there's several months of a follow-up to make sure that they continue to do well.
So, Dr. Siemers, for those people who might be interested in study participation, could you describe a little bit about the risks and benefits that might be associated with the trial?
So the risks and benefits of any clinical trial is a great question, and every clinical trial does have certain risks and certain potential benefits. For this study, it is a phase 1 study, and that means that this drug has not been given to humans before. And so we do lots of laboratory studies to make sure that the drug will be safe in humans, and it's actually fairly rare that you're surprised by something. But that's why people are in the hospital in an inpatient unit in part of the study where you just get the one dose. So there are those risks, and again, it's rare to see something unexpected, but it's not impossible. In terms of the benefits, uh, first of all, I think people should realize that they're contributing to advancing the field, and they're doing something that it may not help them personally, but it may help their brother or children or someone else. And so I think that's an important aspect of this that just can't be overlooked. It's the benefit for society. But the other thing is there are studies showing that people who participate in clinical trials, just in general, do better than people who don't participate in clinical trials. And that may be partly because they get such good overall medical care. I mean, you pick up high cholesterols and all kinds of things for people who participate in trials. Um, and then you get this diagnostic workup as part of the screening process, which we feel really is valuable, and especially including the PET scan to tell you whether or not you actually have these amyloid plaques or not. So that I think is really valuable information, all provided at of course, no cost to the patient.
Mhm. And for all people who might be considering participation, they're provided a description of the study orally and in writing, and all of the requirements of the study, what they'd be expected to do, the risks and the benefits. It's all laid out there in detail in writing, and they have to agree. They sign that consent form in order to participate.
Yeah, that's correct. To participate in any clinical trial, one of the things that happens is a patient will read, and then if they agree to, sign what's called an informed consent statement. And the informed consent statement sort of walks through the potential risks and potential benefits for the person. Typically, these informed consent statements, they may be 20 pages long, and typically patients will have additional questions that they'll want to ask the doctor at the site, and that's certainly part of the process.
What would you envision as the next step if things go well in this study and uh, Acumen decides to move on with the development of ACU 193? What would be the next steps? What's the future?
So the next step for ACU 193 after our phase 1 study is what we would call a phase 2/3 study, and we're planning out the details of that currently. That phase 2/3 study would start as a phase 2 study, and in that phase 2 study, people would probably get drug or placebo for 18 months, so a much longer period of time. But at some point during that study, an independent committee will look at some of the data, and if the data look promising, that study can be scaled up to a phase 3 study. Now, phase 3 study is one that you could take to FDA and other regulatory agencies to try to get approval. One of the other aspects of our plan, and this isn't always the case, but what we've done is for people who are in the phase 1 study, they are eligible to go into the phase 2/3 study. So we kind of think of this as a partnership.
Well, that's great information. I think a lot of patients who are considering participation would probably welcome at least the option or the opportunity to move on if they wanted to. Um, Now, where can people get more information if they wanted to get more information about this project?
For people who are interested in our trial, there are several places actually where they can find out more about it. One is there's a US government website called clinicaltrials.gov. And basically, every clinical trial that's done in the United States is listed on that website. And people could get to that website and then look up the Acumen study and find out a little bit more of the details about the study. The other thing they can do is go to the Acumen website, because on the Acumen website, we now have some information about this INTERCEPT-AD trial. And then finally, some of the sites have their own web pages, and they've added some information on their own web pages in terms of our trial. But I think probably the starting point for most people would be clinicaltrials.gov or the Acumen website.
Mhm. Okay. And the study is being conducted at multiple centers around the United States.
That's correct. It's all in the U.S., but the study is being done at multiple sites in the U.S.
Okay. Do patients have to be referred by their doctors, or can somebody simply call one of these investigator sites and get screened?
Patients don't need a referral from a doctor to enter this trial or other trials, actually. So, um, again, by going through the websites, you could find out a site that's near you geographically and contact them. Some of the web pages do that a little bit better than others, but there's no requirement to have a physician referral to participate in a trial.
Dr. Siemers, is there anything else that you think patients or potential study participants should know about the project?
I think the thing that's really important for people to know just generally is that this is an exciting time, I think, in Alzheimer's research. There were a number of years where we really didn't have a lot of successes, but recently, several of these monoclonal antibodies seem to have some promising results. One of those monoclonal antibodies actually got what's called an accelerated approval from the FDA. And we think we can build on those successes. Um, and so I think participation in any clinical trial is something that people should really be excited about and supportive of. Now, for our ACU 193, again, it has this unique mechanism of targeting A beta oligomers that none of the other monoclonal antibodies have. There's a lot of basic science to say that this is going to be a good approach, but the proof is in the clinic. And so we need to get our clinical trial results. But we feel that, well, again, participation in any clinical trial is a good thing. And we think that this development plan for ACU 193 could potentially be a real advance for the field.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siemers. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you today about Acumen and the development program for ACU 193. We wish you the very best in the progress with your phase 1 study.
Thanks very much.